Welcome back, Troglodytes, to another episode of Trogly's Guitars. Today we're going to discuss the 60s and 70s reissues of the 60s Melody Makers. Now, the 65 Melody Maker is when the Les Paul and the SG were kind of fused together and created this funky fish shape. And this is how they kind of looked in 1965. They came in red finishes, they had some sunburst, as well as Pelham Blues, which are a little bit more rare. But before they switched over to the body style of an SG completely, this is what they looked like. In the 70s, Gibson decided to reissue this model in a slightly different way. You can see these two on the left are the 70s models, and we're going to go over the differences of these today. The first thing to notice is the body shape itself. The horns of the original 60s ones are a little bit more pointed like an SG, whereas on the reissue they're more rounded, kind of like a double cut Les Paul. And the body shape itself is a little bit different. Notice how this one kind of looks like a fish. It kind of has a larger slope here, whereas this one has more of like a butt to it. It's more closely related once again to a double cut Les Paul. It's a little less extreme of a bend in this area compared to there. Perhaps the biggest thing is the wraparound tailpiece. The 70s reissues got the traditional tune-o-matic and stop tailpiece, which makes intonation a little bit easier to do. So in that way, this is a better made guitar. Sometimes these would come with a vibrola tailpiece and you'll have 3 holes there. The original pickups look fairly similar. This is the original pickguard for this one. You can see how it compares to the original 70s pickup. I will say the 60s ones don't quite sound as good as the 70s. The 70s definitely have better pickups in them. And they also have Gibson written on the top of them. Both guitars do have Melody Maker over the tenon cover, as you can see there. The headstock of the 60s one is around 6.5 inches long, whereas the 70s reissue is just about 7 inches, so it is a longer headstock. You'll also notice the shape. The 60s one is more rounded compared to the 70s one, which is a little bit more pointed. The nut width on the 60s one is a little bit narrower, but not by that much. The tuners on the original 3-in-line style Kluson Deluxe tuners with pearl tips. They're not the best tuners in the world, but they do the job. The reissued ones got slightly better tuners. These are what they used on the Flying V's of the day. These are still Kluson styled Gibson Deluxe tuners, but they have the larger pegs on them. Perhaps the biggest difference is the 70s ones got the volute as they had in the day, whereas the 60s ones do not have the volute. And the volute is this lump right here on the back, designed to kind of help protect the headstock in case of trauma. Next thing to compare is neck size. The 60s ones have a really full feeling neck that gets larger and thicker as you go up, whereas the 70s one is more uniform up and down. I would consider the 70s one more of a D-shaped neck, whereas the Melody Maker from the 60s is more of a C-shaped. It's definitely a lot larger than the 70s, but it's still very comfortable since the nut width is slightly smaller. The 70s reissue has a 3-piece mahogany neck, whereas the original has a single-piece mahogany neck. You can see the neck joints are slightly different on these as well. It's not as strong as a neck joint on the original one as compared to the 70s one. Overall, I would say the finish is thinner on the 60s one and thicker on the 70s, but I would still say the 70s is actually the better made guitar. It feels a little bit more well polished and sounds a little better. You have better intonation, and I think that's why these usually go for a premium. These still feel just as good as a Les Paul standard, whereas these, they might feel a little bit cheaper, but I almost would suggest a 60s one over a 70s one, because there's some type of aura to this guitar and all of these 65s that I've had that just make these awesome guitars. They're very acoustically resonant. They look just like vintage SGs, and they kind of sound like them too when you replace their pickups. And they age a little bit more gracefully, and the wood just looks a little more alive. Overall, both of them are great choices. Let me know which one you guys prefer. Alright, Troglodytes, thank you for tuning in. I hope you like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.